Hello, so this is your lecture for the Age of Enlightenment. So we are going to go ahead and talk about the Enlightenment. I previewed the Enlightenment a little bit during our lecture about the scientific revolution, but here we go. So the Age of Enlightenment was a period, let me get my little, let me mark. Ugh, sorry, I was trying to mark it, but that's okay. So it's a period of new philosophy. So that's important. And ideas about the nature of life. So it's a period of new philosophy. The Age of Enlightenment came out of the scientific revolution. And they said, just like Newton's laws of motion, society is also governed by natural laws that are understood between members of society. So they were looking for new ways to govern that were in line with these natural laws. And the place that most of this thinking was happening was Paris. So in the old regime, society was built on tradition. There was a world of hierarchy. We all know what a social hierarchy is, privilege and strong inequality. Part of this was because of the monarchy, especially in France. You'll remember the monarchy at the time was lavishly spending money and living richly. The aristocracy was living richly, and the poor were getting poorer. So the church was also this big ultimate power, even in France, even after the Protestant Revolution, because France was a Catholic country. And the Enlightenment kind of challenged this idea of the old regime, challenged the powers that were. So, of course, because people in the Enlightenment were challenging old ideas, they were censored pretty frequently. So a lot of publishers and writers were attacked in writing, in media, things like that, by the government. And over 1,000 booksellers and writers were actually imprisoned in France in the early 1700s for things like treason and stuff like that. Okay, so that brings us to the philosophes. So the philosophes are what we call 18th century French intellectuals or philosophers. And the philosophes, they believed that they were trying to find truth through reason. This comes from Descartes, who was a philosopher, who said that our greatest power is our ability to be rational, to reason things out. So philosophers would gather at these things called salons, key term, which were where wealthy women would have a bunch of smart people basically come at their home. They would have tea and they would exchange ideas with one another and talk about their ideas about philosophy and how the world should be governed. So these Enlightenment ideas that came out of these salons were mostly known among the urban upper class, so upper middle class, not so much the aristocracy, but people, the bourgeoisie, which we'll talk about more in the French Revolution. So people who are, well known enough to be invited to wealthy women's salons. This isn't poor people. Another reason that it's the upper middle class is, of course, because you need to know how to read. So one thing that did contribute to the Enlightenment is that literacy was actually going up and the availability of books was going up too. So because people are now becoming more well-read, due to the age of exploration, we now have a middle class, this merchant middle class. The Enlightenment, the ideas of Enlightenment are going to kind of be aimed at that middle class that's going to want more power, that can read, and that is gathering and exchanging ideas. Excuse me. So the Enlightenment had a tremendous impact on our world today. First of all, it inspired both the American and French revolutions. As we're going to see, it heavily influenced the establishment of the American government and many other constitutional governments. The Enlightenment presented these new ideas about human rights and about humans having basic civil rights that had not really existed before the Enlightenment, at least conceptually. And it's going to create this tradition that has been happening over the last couple hundred years of questioning government, of thinking governments should work for their people. So let's take a look at some of the philosophers. Now, not all of these philosophers are French, but most of them are. John Locke is not French, for example, he's English. And John Locke is one of the most important philosophers because he actually influenced the rest of the Enlightenment thinkers. So the really important thing to remember with John Locke, there are two concepts for John Locke that I really, really want you to remember. The first is that Locke believes that humans are naturally good. So he says that humans are good. We're born with what he calls the tabula rasa, the blank slate. And so this means that people are influenced by what they experience. And so if you give them the right influences, then you can create an ideal society. The second really big thing from John Locke is the idea of natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Does that sound familiar? It should. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, should sound familiar. And yes, I recited that from memory. You know, you can't see me. I am a nerd. So the government is supposed to protect these natural rights. And if the government fails to protect those rights, then the people have grounds to revolt. So if we were in person, I would say, what does this remind you of? And you would say, Rachel, this reminds me of the Mandate of Heaven, because I remember very well our unit on ancient China. And you would be right that this sounds kind of without the part of the divine right, but it sounds like if someone is not being a good leader, then they deserve to have revolution brought upon them. Thomas Hobbes is the opposite of John Locke, and he's kind of the outlier among our philosophers. So some people will tell you that Thomas Hobbes, and that is the namesake of Hobbes from Calvin and Hobbes. Some of you would say Thomas Hobbes thinks people are naturally evil. It's more that Hobbes thinks people are naturally selfish or naturally self-involved. So Hobbes said that people only give their power to the government in exchange for protection, that people are always going to look out for themselves. And the only reason that we agree to let the government take away some of our rights, and when he says take away rights, what he means is like, you know, taxation or our right to just take anyone's property that we want or kill anyone without repercussions, things like that. And we only give those rights away in exchange for protection. But Hobbes also argues that because human beings are so naturally selfish, that they need a strong leader to control them. And so Hobbes actually was very much in favor of absolute monarchies, which puts him at odds with the other philosophers, because most of them were in support of constitutional republics. All right, now we have Francois Alouet, I'm sorry for my terrible French, or Voltaire, as he's better known. So Voltaire was a strong supporter of the idea of separation of church and state. Voltaire was in Catholic France, which was obviously a tremendously religious environment. And Voltaire really admired the Parliament of England and wanted France to model its government, which at this point it had not had a parliamentary assembly in a long, long time. Voltaire said we should have a parliament modeled off of British Parliament, and one that has the church separated from the state. Now, of course, that wasn't true of British Parliament at the time because of the Act of Supremacy. Voltaire also believed in deism. So deism was a religious philosophy based on reason and natural law. And the idea behind deism is that God was what they called the watchmaker, the clockmaker. That the world, the universe is a clock, that there is a God, and that God did create the universe, but then God just kind of stepped away and let the universe run independently. So that's the idea behind deism, which is what a lot of philosophers believed in. All right, then we've got Montesquieu. So Montesquieu's big contribution here is that he believed that power should check power, which is going to lead us to the idea of checks and balances. Again, if you have studied the American government in any capacity, you should have already heard this term before, checks and balances. So checks and balances is the idea that you divide a government up so that power can check power. For example, looking at the United States government, our government is divided into three branches: executive, legislative, and judiciary. And these three branches all have power over each other. If the legislative branch passes a law, the executive branch can veto it. The legislative branch can deny requests made by the executive branch. The legislative branch has to approve any appointments to the Supreme Court by the executive branch. The Supreme Court can say that documents passed by the legislative branch are not constitutional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Montesquieu studied many different kinds of government, and he basically came up with these three different forms of government: republics, monarchies, and despotism, which means tyranny. And he said, of all of these, a constitutional republic is ideal. And we're going to see this, obviously, in many revolutions and establishments of new government from the 1700s on. Then we've got Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Rousseau touted this idea called the social contract. This is kind of like what Hobbes believed in, but in a less cynical way. It's very, very similar. Basically, what he says is that society agrees to give rights up to the government, and the government then protects the citizens' natural rights. So again, these are things like we agree to pay taxes to the government rather than just hoarding all of our money for ourselves. In exchange, the government protects our right to life, liberty, and property. Same like we agree to send our kids to school from certain ages, or we agree to not murder other people, or we suffer the consequences if we do those things. And then in exchange, the government is supposed to protect those natural rights. And again, just like John Locke, if the government fails to protect those natural rights, what happens? Revolution. Rousseau is kind of different from other philosophers, and this is just something cool that I like about him. So Rousseau actually believed in child-led education. He thought that education should nurture children, and he also believed that emotions were critical to human development. A lot of philosophers were just like logic, logic, reason, reason. But Rousseau said, no, 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 we need to nurture people, and we need to recognize that emotions are actually really important too. So Rousseau was kind of ahead of his time in that respect. All right, then we've got Mary Wollstonecraft. So Mary Wollstonecraft is actually the mother of one of my favorite historical women, Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. If you have me, you've heard the whole story about Frankenstein and why I love Mary Shelley before. So Mary Wollstonecraft basically said women are rational beings. And since women are rational beings, they deserve to have equal rights to men. And since women are rational beings, that means that men ruling over women is equivalent to despotism. She says that just like kings have no right to rule over men, men have no right to rule over women. Obviously, Mary Wollstonecraft was ahead of her time. The suffrage movement would not start to gain traction for another 100 years after she wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and the suffrage would not be gained for much longer after that. Okay, so you are going to do an assignment where you're going to collect some of the ideas of the Age of Enlightenment, and then you'll have a quiz based over the Age of Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution. But y'all can really see now how the Age of Enlightenment, these Enlightenment thinkers were really inspired by the thinkers of the Scientific Revolution, and they basically wanted to take those ideas from the Scientific Revolution, especially like the idea of there being natural laws and the idea of observing and experimenting and using logic and reason. They wanted to take those scientific methods and apply them to philosophy. All right, cool. Let me know if you have any questions, and bye.